To most people, James Dean was more than just a movie star. He was a feeling, a fleeting spark that burned so bright. It lit up an entire generation before vanishing too soon. His face, that brooding stare, that faint, half-smile came to define what it meant to be young, restless, and misunderstood in 1950s America. But behind those piercing eyes was a boy from a small Indiana town, who carried within him both the dreams of the open sky and the weight of a lonely heart. James Byron Dean was born on February 8, 1931, in Marion, Indiana. He grew up like any other small-town kid, playing baseball, riding his bike, and gazing up at the stars. But life wasn't gentle to him. When he was just 9, tragedy struck. His mother, Mildred, the one person who truly understood him, died of cancer. For James, it was as if the world had gone dim overnight. He was sent to live with his aunt and uncle on a farm in Fairmount, Indiana. Those endless cornfields, the smell of hay, the sound of wind rustling through the barn, that's where James learned what silence felt like. Even then, people said he had a look in his eyes, distant, searching, like someone waiting for a train that would never come. His uncle once said, Jimmy could stand in a field and make you feel like he was listening to the wind talk. Maybe that's why, even as a boy, he loved motion motorcycles, cars, anything that could make the world blur. He'd say later in life, racing is the only time I feel whole. Perhaps he wasn't chasing speed. Perhaps he was chasing freedom. When he finished high school, James had one dream, to be somebody. Not rich, not powerful, just seen. He packed his bags and left Indiana for California, hoping to find a place that could understand the restless fire inside him. But Hollywood in the late 1940s wasn't kind to dreamers. He worked odd jobs, parking cars, delivering packages, even milking cows on a ranch, while auditioning for anything that would get him noticed. At first, no one knew what to do with him. He wasn't conventionally handsome like Rock Hudson or Cary Grant. He wasn't charming in the studio polished way Hollywood liked. But when James Dean stepped in front of a camera, something happened. It was raw, unpredictable. He made you feel. His acting wasn't about reciting lines. It was about living them. He studied under Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio in New York, the legendary birthplace of method acting. There, James learned to pour his soul into his roles. Friends remembered how he'd stay up all night, sitting in coffee shops, scribbling poetry or sketching cars on napkins. One classmate said, Jimmy didn't act like a movie star, he acted like someone trying to find himself. And that's exactly what America saw when he appeared in East of Eden in 1955. The moment he walked onto the screen, audiences leaned in. Here was a young man who wasn't pretending he was hurting, wanting, rebelling. Critics said he made the character of Cal Trask so real. It was like watching someone's soul unfold. For his performance, he received his first Oscar nomination, the first posthumous nomination in Academy history, though no one knew at the time that he wouldn't live to see it. Then came Rebel Without a Cause. The title alone could have been written for him. As Jim Stark, the troubled teen yearning for understanding, Dean became the voice of a generation. Teenagers across America saw themselves in him, misunderstood by their parents, lost between rules and rebellion. When he shouted, "You're tearing me apart," it wasn't just a line. It was a cry from the heart of 1952's youth. But while the world saw a star rising, James saw something else, a life speeding out of control. Fame never sat comfortably on his shoulders. He was shy, often quiet, sometimes moody. He preferred motorcycles and dirt roads over red carpets. Co-stars said he'd show up to set with grease on his hands, having worked on his car all morning. He lived in a small apartment filled with books, records, and car parts, not luxury, but chaos. He once told a reporter, "Being an actor is lonely. You spend your life pretending to be other people. Sometimes you forget who you really are." And when he wasn't filming, James was racing. It wasn't just a hobby, it was an obsession. The roar of an engine, the scent of gasoline, the vibration of speed. It was the only place he felt alive and in control. His Porsche 550 Spyder wasn't just a car. It was his companion. He called it Little Bastard, a name that would soon become a haunting echo in Hollywood lore. To those who knew him, James's passion for racing was both inspiring and terrifying. He'd say, "If a man can't do what he loves, what's the point of living?" He raced whenever he could, on weekends, between shoots, often to the frustration of studio executives who feared their new star would get hurt. Warner Bros. Even added a clause in his contract forbidding him from racing while filming Giant, his last movie. But James didn't listen. He never did. Maybe he felt the walls of fame closing in on him. Or maybe he knew something deep down. That life, no matter how bright, could end in a flash. Either way, he kept driving. Fast, fearless, free. By 1955, he was just 24 years old and already a cultural phenomenon. His fame had exploded overnight, yet he remained humble, lost in thought, almost fragile. Friends said he often spoke about death, not morbidly, but philosophically. He once told a journalist, "Dream as if you'll live forever. Live as if you'll die today." Those words, spoken offhandedly, would become his epitaph. And so, as autumn arrived that year, James Dean prepared for a new race, one he'd never finish. The open highway called his name once more, and with it came the drive that would forever change Hollywood history. By the fall of 1955, James Dean had everything he thought he wanted. 3 major films east of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant had made him a star. His face was on every magazine cover. Fans sent letters by the thousands, calling him the new Marlon Brando, the symbol of rebellion, the future of Hollywood. But James didn't see himself that way. Fame, to him, was a cage, and every engine he revved, every mile he drove, was a small rebellion against it. He loved cars not for the glamour, but for what they represented: freedom. In a time when Hollywood stars were carefully packaged and polished, James was different. He worked on his own engines. He got grease under his nails. He didn't pose beside cars, he lived in them. He started racing seriously in early 1955, entering events in Palm Springs and Bakersfield. Reporters who came expecting a movie star showing off were surprised. He wasn't there for attention, he was there to win. And he did. In his first race at Palm Springs, James finished second overall and first in his class. His natural talent and calm intensity behind the wheel impressed even seasoned racers. They said he drove like he acted instinctively, emotionally, like he was channeling something deep within. But his passion worried the studios. During the filming of Giant, Warner Bros. Executives banned him from racing until the movie wrapped. They feared bad publicity, or worse. Dean reluctantly agreed, though his thoughts often wandered back to the racetrack. When Giant finished shooting in mid-September 1955, Dean was free again. Free to race, to drive, to feel alive. He immediately ordered a brand new silver Porsche 550 Spyder, a sleek, featherlight racing machine capable of over 120 miles per hour. He customized it with red leather seats, red racing stripes, and the number 130 painted boldly on the hood, doors, and rear deck. On the back, his mechanic and friend, George Barris, hand-painted 2 words that would later become infamous: Little Bastard. Barris once said Dean laughed when he saw it. "That's me," he said. Little Bastard. The name wasn't about arrogance. It was self-deprecating humor. Dean knew he had a reputation for being stubborn, moody, unpredictable. But behind that nickname was affection. It was the name he gave to the one machine he trusted completely. That same week, James prepared for a race in Salinas, California, a small agricultural town about 90 miles south of San Francisco. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, a chance to test his new Porsche before competing in more professional races later that year. He invited a few close friends to join him for the trip: his mechanic, Rolf W. Therick, a skilled German technician who knew every bolt in the car; his friend and photographer Sanford Roth; and actor Bill Hickman, who drove Dean's Ford station wagon carrying spare parts and luggage. The plan was simple: drive from Hollywood to Salinas, stay overnight, race the next day, and return home by Sunday. But fate had a different route in mind. On the morning of Friday, September 30, 1955, James woke up excited. Friends said he was in unusually good spirits. He put on his favorite red windbreaker, blue jeans, and a white t-shirt. Simple, comfortable, unmistakably Jimmy. He called a few friends, made some jokes, and stopped by the Warner Bros. Studio to pick up some papers. One of his co-stars from Giant recalled him saying, "You know, if I don't make it back, at least I lived fast." No one took it seriously. Why would they? He was 24, young, unstoppable, full of life. By early afternoon, he met with Rolf and Roth at Competition Motors in Hollywood, where the Porsche was being tuned for the drive. They checked the oil, the tires, the brakes. Everything was perfect. Roth planned to photograph Dean along the way for a magazine piece about his racing career. Around 1:30 p.m., James slipped into the driver's seat, fastened his seatbelt, and grinned. The silver Porsche shimmered under the California sun like a bullet made of light. As he revved the engine, another actor, Alec Guinness, happened to pass by the cafe nearby. The British star, later known for playing Obi-Wan Kenobi, recalled that he had dinner with Dean the night before. He remembered something eerie. James had shown him the car proudly, saying, "Isn't it beautiful?" Guinness later wrote that he felt an inexplicable chill. He told Dean, "If you get in that car, you'll be found dead in it within a week." Dean laughed it off. The next day, he was gone. At about p.m., James and Rolf began their journey north on U.S. Route 99. Roth and Hickman followed behind in the Ford wagon. The first few miles were smooth, open, alive with the sound of the Porsche's engine echoing off the highway. Dean loved that sound. He said it was like music, a heartbeat. But Los Angeles traffic was thick that afternoon, so after an hour, they decided to take a less crowded route. Highway 466, a long, winding road cutting through California's farmlands and desert plains. It was scenic, peaceful, but also dangerous with sharp turns and narrow lanes. Along the way, Dean was stopped by police near Bakersfield for speeding 65 in a 55 zone. It was just a warning, nothing serious. He smiled, signed the ticket, and continued driving. The officer later said Dean was polite, calm, and a rush. "He didn't look like a Hollywood type," he said. "Just a kid who loved cars." By late afternoon, the sun began to dip lower in the sky. They stopped briefly at Blackwell's corner, a small roadside gas station and cafe. Dean bought an apple and a Coke, chatting casually with other drivers. Roth took some final photographs, James leaning on the Porsche, smiling, carefree. Those would become the last pictures ever taken of him alive. From Blackwell's corner, they continued west toward Paso Robles, where they planned to have dinner before reaching Salinas. Dean was in high spirits, occasionally revving the engine, sometimes laughing, sometimes silent as if lost in thought. Rolf later said he seemed completely at peace. The two talked about cars, life, and how Dean wanted to transition from acting to racing full-time. He dreamed of competing professionally one day, maybe even in Europe. At approximately 5:15 p.m., they entered the long stretch of Highway 466 near Kalame Junction, an isolated crossroads where two highways met in the middle of golden farmland. The light was fading. The air was still. There, at the same moment, a young college student named Donald Turnipseed was driving his 1950 Ford Tudor Coupe eastbound. He was making a left turn onto Highway 41, not realizing that a silver Porsche was approaching rapidly from the opposite direction. Witnesses later said they saw the two cars moving toward each other at high speed. The Ford began its turn. Dean, unable to stop in time, shouted to Rolf, "He's gotta see us." Rolf's final memory was of James trying to swerve, but it was too late. The Porsche struck the Ford almost head-on, catapulting through the air, spinning several times before crashing into a ditch. The sound was deafening, wheel twisting, glass shattering, the violent end of motion. Roth and Hickman, a few miles behind, arrived moments later to a scene of chaos. Dust hung in the air. The Porsche was crumpled beyond recognition, its silver body twisted like paper. Dean was trapped inside, unconscious, but still breathing faintly. His friend Rolf had been thrown from the car and was badly injured, but alive. Donald Turnipseed staggered from his Ford, dazed, with only minor injuries. Paramedics rushed to the scene within minutes. They cut open the wreck, lifted James out, and laid him gently on the ground. His arms were limp, his face pale, his red jacket torn. Someone whispered his name, but he didn't respond. At 5:59 p.m., September 30, 1955, James Byron Dean was pronounced dead on arrival at Paso Robles War Memorial Hospital. He was 24 years old. The news spread like wildfire. Reporters rushed to the hospital. Crowds gathered outside the morgue. The world had lost not just a movie star, but a symbol. A generation that had seen itself reflected in his eyes suddenly felt orphaned. Warner Bros. Halted production of Giant's publicity campaign in shock. Rebel Without a Cause hadn't even premiered yet. In a tragic twist, James Dean became immortal before he could even see himself on screen as the legend the world would remember. Back at the scene, the wrecked Porsche was loaded onto a flatbed truck. As it was being towed away, a wheel slipped off and injured a mechanic's leg, the first of many strange accidents that would surround the remains of Little Bastard. Some said the car was cursed. Others said it was just coincidence. But to those who had loved James, it felt like the car carried a piece of his restless spirit, still running, still searching for an open road. The following days were filled with mourning and disbelief. Newspapers across America printed the same haunting photograph: James Dean, young, smiling, unaware that he had just hours to live. Fans wrote letters, poets wrote tributes, and his hometown of Fairmount, Indiana, prepared for the return of its lost son. At the funeral, hundreds of people gathered. Friends, fans, and family wept quietly as the small casket was lowered into the earth. The preacher said, "Here lies a boy who burned too bright to last." His father stood silently, grief hidden behind dark glasses. And somewhere in that Indiana wind, perhaps the boy who once listened to the fields could finally rest. But the story of James Dean didn't end there. In fact, it had only just begun. The morning after September 30, 1955, the world woke to silence, a silence that felt heavier than most. Newspapers across America carried the same headline: James Dean killed in car crash. It didn't seem real. How could it? The man who embodied life, rebellion, and speed gone in an instant. For millions, it felt like the end of innocence. Radio stations replayed his interviews, the ones where he talked about living fast, about not fearing death. Reporters quoted his words like prophecy. In one eerie clip recorded just weeks earlier, James had been asked about his love for racing. He'd replied, "I think I'll take it easy for a while, but you can't drive safe unless you're alert. If you're driving, stay alive." Then he smiled shyly at the camera. The film crew laughed, not realizing those words would soon echo around the world with tragic irony. Fans flooded theaters, watching East of Eden and Rebel Without a Cause, not just as movies but as farewells. They sat in the dark, tears streaming silently, as his face flickered across the screen, alive, vibrant, untamed. When Rebel Without a Cause premiered a month after his death, audiences wept openly. The film's story, a troubled young man searching for connection, felt like a message from beyond. Suddenly, James Dean wasn't just a star. He was a myth, a symbol of youth frozen in time, a face that would never age, never fade, never conform. Hollywood, too, didn't know what to do with his loss. Directors, producers, and actors spoke about him in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb his spirit. Elizabeth Taylor, his co-star in Giant, was devastated. She had been close to him during filming. They shared laughter, long talks, and mutual understanding. When she heard the news, she locked herself in her room and cried for days. She later said, "Jimmy had a sadness that never left him. Maybe that's why we all loved him. He carried our pain for us." And then there was Giant, his final film. Dean had finished shooting only days before the accident. When the studio reviewed the footage, they realized how eerie it felt watching him age decades on screen when, in real life, he'd never see 25. The director, George Stevens, described editing the film as like watching a ghost perform. When Giant finally premiered in 1956, James Dean received another Academy Award nomination, his second, posthumously. Few in history had achieved that honor. In the audience that night, people rose in tribute, clapping for a man who was no longer there, but his absence made him eternal. In the years that followed, something remarkable happened. James Dean stopped being just an actor. He became an idea. Posters of his image, that famous red jacket, cigarette hanging loosely, eyes full of defiance, appeared in bedrooms, dorms, and garages across America. Teenagers who hadn't even been born when he lived began to identify with him. They saw in Dean what they saw in themselves: confusion, rebellion, a longing to break free. Sociologists began calling him the first teenage icon. Before Dean, youth culture didn't really have a voice. He gave it one: raw, emotional, imperfect, real. Every generation since has found something in him that speaks to their hearts. But behind the fame and myth, there were people left behind: friends, family, those who knew the real Jimmy. His father, Winton Dean, was a quiet man, never one for emotions. Their relationship had always been distant. When James was a boy, he longed for his father's approval, but after his mother's death, that bond had fractured. When Winton received his son's remains, he broke down quietly, privately, far from the cameras. He brought Jimmy home to Fairmount, Indiana, where he was buried on a small hill under a simple headstone. To this day, fans travel from all over the world to that tiny cemetery. They leave flowers, cigarettes, photographs, even toy cars, small tokens of love for the boy who refused to slow down. The gravestone has been replaced several times due to visitors chipping away small pieces as souvenirs. Everyone wants a part of James Dean even now. Then there was the Porsche, little bastard. After the crash, it was purchased by George Barris, the custom car builder, who had originally designed it for Dean. Barris intended to display it as a cautionary exhibit about road safety, but soon after, strange things began to happen. While transporting the wreck, the car slipped off a trailer and broke a mechanic's leg. Later, pieces of the car that were reused by other racers seemed to bring bad luck. One driver was seriously injured, another killed. Even the garage storing the remains mysteriously caught fire, though the car itself survived almost untouched. Eventually, the wreck vanished. While being transported to an exhibit in 1960, it has never been seen again. People whispered that the Porsche was cursed. Rational minds dismissed it as coincidence, but for many, it was as if Dean's restless spirit had fused with the machine that took him away. Years later, an old friend of his once said, "Jimmy didn't die in that crash. He just kept driving, somewhere out there, on a road none of us can see." And maybe that's the truth, because James Dean's story has never really ended. It's told again and again in songs, books, films, in the hearts of those who still feel his presence. Elvis Presley idolized him. The Beatles sang about him. Bob Dylan said Dean inspired him to become an artist. Decades later, musicians like Bruce Springsteen and Lana Del Rey would reference him in their lyrics, proof that his flame still burns. Generation after generation. Even in Hollywood, his influence lingers. Actors like Martin Sheen, Al Pacino, and Leonardo DiCaprio have cited him as their greatest inspiration. His acting style, spontaneous, emotional, raw, changed cinema forever. Before Dean, actors performed for the camera. After him, they felt for it. But beyond the fame and film, there's a deeper reason his story endures. One that resonates especially with those who've lived long enough to see how fragile life really is. James Dean reminds us that time is a thief, that no matter how brightly we shine, the road always ends too soon. But it's not how long we live that matters, it's how deeply. He once said in an interview, "I'm trying to find the answer to life. Maybe there isn't one, but I'd rather die trying than not try at all." And in a way, that's what he did. He lived trying to understand, to feel, to connect, to break free. For older fans who remember him, James Dean is not just a memory, he's a mirror. He represents a time when life was simpler, when the future was wide open, when dreams felt endless. Watching his films today still stirs something inside, a nostalgia for youth, for courage, for that moment when the engine starts and the world stretches before you. There's a reason his story still moves people. Because we've all had our final drives. Moments when we thought we had all the time in the world, only to realize how precious every mile truly is. At the intersection where he died, now called the James Dean Memorial Junction, there stands a quiet monument. It's small, silver, and unassuming, surrounded by open fields. The wind there seems to whisper through the grass, carrying with it echoes of that September evening. Visitors stand silently, some closing their eyes, as if hoping to hear the roar of the Porsche one last time. Local farmers still say that on certain nights, when the air is still and the sky is clear, they can hear the faint hum of an engine, far away, fading into the distance. Maybe it's just the wind, or maybe it's James Dean, still chasing the horizon. Nearly 70 years later, his face remains timeless. His story continues to be retold, not because of how he died, but because of how he lived. He lived truthfully, without masks. He felt everything, pain, loneliness, and he poured it all into his art. That's why his legacy refuses to fade. Every time an old fan rewatches Rebel without a cause, or a young dreamer hangs his poster on their wall, James Dean is alive again, not as a tragic figure, but as a symbol of freedom. Freedom from rules, freedom from fear, freedom from time itself. And maybe that's what his final drive truly meant, not an ending, but a beginning. A reminder to live every moment as if it's the only one we'll ever have. Because somewhere, beyond the noise and the years, that young man in a red jacket is still out there. Wind in his hair, engine roaring, eyes fixed on the horizon, forever driving into legend. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to honor James Dean's memory, not with sadness, but with gratitude. He showed us what it means to live passionately, fearlessly, and authentically. If you believe his legacy still inspires today, please like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who remembers the magic of Hollywood's golden era. Because legends like James Dean never really die. They just take the long way home.